Second Lieutenant Francis Nordstrom heard the first round leave the enemy gun before he understood what it meant. It cracked past his turret and buried itself in the frozen ground behind him. The date was October 29, 1950. The place was a low ridge of rice terraces and scattered pine outside the North Korean town of Cheongju, less than 70 kilometers from the Manchurian border. His platoon of Sherman tanks had pushed out ahead of the infantry, and now the brush along the road was moving. Dug into the hillside in front of him, hull down and hidden under cut branches, sat a line of T-34 tanks that had been waiting in silence for exactly this moment. Every man in Nordstrom's tank knew the reputation of the machine in front of them. For the opening weeks of the war, the T-34 had been the most feared object on the Korean peninsula. American soldiers had fired everything they owned at it and watched their shots skip away like stones thrown across water. The cold air smelled of pine sap and diesel exhaust. Nordstrom's gunner already had a round seated in the breech. What happened in the next few minutes on that ridge would say more about the real story of armor in Korea than any headline ever has. Before we go any further, I want to ask a small favor. Cold War Impact is a small history channel, and the only way these deep-dive documentaries reach new people is through you. If you find this kind of carefully researched military history worth your time, please consider subscribing, leaving a comment, and sharing the video. Every single interaction tells the algorithm that this work matters, and it lets me keep making films like this one. Now back to that ridge outside Cheongju, and to the question of how a tank built to fight a different war on a different continent ended up here at all. To understand why Nordstrom's Sherman mattered that morning, you have to go back to the start of the summer. You have to go back to the weeks when nothing the United States Army owned could stop what was coming down the roads of South Korea. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, they brought with them a weapon the defenders simply could not answer. It was the T-34-85, a Soviet-built medium tank, and it carried a pedigree of victory behind it. This was the design that had helped break the German army on the Eastern Front in the Second World War. Its armor was sloped, which meant an incoming shot struck the steel at an angle and tended to glance away rather than punch through. Its 85mm gun could tear through the side of almost anything the Americans had in Asia. Its diesel engine was rugged, simple, and hard to set on fire. The invading army fielded an armored force built around roughly 120 of these tanks, organized into a single powerful brigade, and the crews had trained on these machines for years. South Korea, on the other side of the line, had no tanks at all. It had almost nothing that could even scratch one. The result in those first weeks was not a battle so much as a steady, grinding collapse. Seoul, the South Korean capital, fell within 3 days of the invasion. The T-34s rolled down the main roads in long columns, and the defenders simply fell back ahead of them. The tank became more than a weapon. It became a kind of rumor that arrived before the engines did, and the rumor said the same thing every time. This thing cannot be stopped. The first time the United States Army tried to stop it in the open, the result was a catastrophe that ought never to be forgotten. On July 5, 1950, a small American force took up positions on 2 low ridges straddling the main highway north of the town of Osan. It was a few hundred men, 2 understrength rifle companies, and a single battery of artillery, all commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith. Most of the soldiers were young. Many had been pulled from soft occupation duty in Japan only weeks before, where the hardest part of the day had been a morning inspection. They had been pushed forward as a kind of speed bump, a force meant to make the North Koreans pause, deploy, and think twice. The North Koreans did not pause, and they did not think twice. A column of T-34 tanks came down the highway toward the ridges and simply kept driving. The American artillery had only a tiny number of the special-shaped charge anti-tank rounds that might have done some good, and once those few were gone, the ordinary high-explosive shells burst against the sloped armor and achieved nothing. The infantry came forward with their rocket launchers, the small shoulder-fired bazookas they had carried over from the last war. The rockets struck the tanks squarely and failed to punch through the steel. One young officer fired round after round at a single T-34 from close enough to make out the bolts on its hull, and watched every last rocket fail. The tanks ground straight through the position and continued south without slowing. The American force was shattered, with heavy casualties, and the lesson was carved into the survivors who walked out. The weapons they had simply were not enough. The shock of that first encounter rippled all the way back up the chain of command. The small standard rocket launcher, the weapon the infantry had trusted to deal with tanks since the last war, had been exposed as useless against the thick sloped armor of the T-34. A heavier, more powerful rocket launcher was rushed to Korea by air to replace it, and it did improve matters, giving the foot soldier at least a fighting chance against armor at close range. But a rocket launcher in the hands of a single brave man, fired from a ditch at a tank that was already on top of his position, was a weapon of last resort, not a solution. What was truly needed was a tank that could meet a tank, find it at range, and kill it before it ever reached the infantry at all. Until that arrived, the men in the line had to fight the T-34 the hard way, with courage and improvisation, standing in for the equipment they did not have. Through the rest of July, that lesson repeated itself in different places across the peninsula. The light American tank of the period, a thin-skinned reconnaissance vehicle with a small-caliber gun, was no match for the T-34 and was knocked out wherever the two machines met. The fighting fell into a bitter pattern of retreat. The defenders were pushed back into a shrinking corner in the southeastern tip of the country, a defensive box anchored on the port city of Pusan and the line of the Naktong River. Inside that perimeter stood the last United Nations forces left on the peninsula. Outside it, pressing in from the north and the west, were the North Korean divisions and their armored spearheads. The line was bending under the weight, and everyone who held it could feel just how close it was to snapping. It is hard to overstate how narrow the margin was in those August weeks. The defended pocket was a rough rectangle, only a little more than 100 kilometers across at its widest, with the sea at the defenders' backs and a single great port, Pusan, as the lifeline through which every soldier, every shell, and every gallon of fuel had to flow. If that port fell, the war was effectively over, and the peninsula was lost. The North Koreans understood this perfectly, and they hammered the perimeter at point after point, probing for the weak seam that would let their armor pour through into the rear. The defenders, thin on the ground and exhausted, were shuffled from crisis to crisis like a fire brigade, plugging each breakthrough as it came. Into this desperate situation, the first American medium tanks began to arrive, not as a grand armored reserve massed for a decisive blow, but in ones and twos and small companies, fed straight into the line wherever the pressure was worst. Now we have to climb the ridge and look at the war from the other side, because the confidence of the North Korean tank crews in that summer was not foolish or arrogant. It was earned, day by day, in combat. The men driving those T-34s had every reason to believe they were unbeatable, and the belief rested on plain evidence. They had crossed the border and won. They had taken the enemy capital in 3 days. They had met the best the Americans rushed in front of them and rolled clean over it. Their tank carried a genuine history of dominance, and in the summer of 1950, on the ground in Korea, nothing had yet proven that history wrong. Their confidence came down, in the end, to a single quiet assumption. They assumed the Americans had no medium tank anywhere in the theater that could meet them on equal terms. And in those first weeks, that assumption was completely, dangerously correct. What the North Korean crews did not know was that the answer to their tank was not some new invention waiting on a drawing board. It was old. It already existed, in large numbers, scattered across storage depots and scrapyards, and even a handful of memorial pedestals on the far side of the Pacific Ocean. The weapon that would finally break the spell of the T-34 was a tank left over from the last war, and getting it to Korea would turn out to be a story of frantic improvisation rather than clever engineering. There is a bitter irony buried in this that is worth sitting with for a moment. The answer to the crisis of that summer had not been lost or undiscovered. It had been built in the thousands only a few years earlier, fielded across Europe, and then judged surplus to need and set aside. The very capability the dying men at Osan would have given anything for already existed, in working order, in warehouses an ocean away. The failure was not one of invention. It was a failure of foresight, of a nation that had won a great war and then dismantled its readiness so quickly that it had to scramble to rearm against a threat it should have seen coming. The Easy-8 did not have to be designed. It only had to be found, repaired and shipped, and the weeks that took were paid for in ground given up and lives lost holding the line. The tank in question was a late version of the American Sherman, the famous workhorse of the Second World War. By 1950, the Sherman was widely considered yesterday's machine, a vehicle the Army was steadily phasing out of service. But the final wartime model of it was a far more capable thing than its tired reputation suggested. This was the M4A3E8, a long designation that the crews quickly shortened into a nickname. They called it the Easy-8. The Easy-8 earned its respect through two important upgrades over the older Shermans. The first was a new suspension system that rode on wider tracks and gave a smoother, steadier ride, which let the tank move better over rough and broken ground and gave a more stable platform for the gun. That improved suspension was the actual source of the Easy-8 nickname. The second upgrade was the gun itself. The Easy-8 carried a high-velocity 76mm cannon, a real step up from the short, stubby gun that had armed most wartime Shermans. On its own, the ordinary armor-piercing shot from that 76 still struggled to defeat the well-sloped front of a T-34. But there was a special round available for it, a tungsten cord shot designed to punch through heavy armor at speed. And here was the crucial difference from the last war. In Korea, that special ammunition was available in real quantity. With it, the 76mm gun could defeat the front of a T-34 at normal fighting range. In raw terms, the two tanks were closely matched, closer than the legend of either one would suggest. The T-34 had thicker frontal protection and a slightly heavier gun, but the Sherman carried advantages that did not show up in a simple table of armor and caliber. It had a far better gun sight and fire control system, which meant its crew could find a target, lay the gun, and fire accurately in less time. It had a powered turret traverse that was smoother and easier to control. It had a roomier, better arranged fighting compartment, which mattered enormously in a close fight, where the crew that got off the first aimed shot usually won. A captured intelligence summary of the period warned American crews plainly that the enemy 85mm gun would penetrate their Shermans, so no one was under any illusion that the Easy-8 was invulnerable. What the Sherman offered was not thicker skin, it was a better trained, better equipped crew with the tools to shoot first and shoot straight. It is worth understanding just how finely balanced the contest between the two guns really was, because it explains why crew skill mattered so much. The T-34's 85mm gun could punch through the side and rear of a Sherman with relative ease, and at close range it could threaten the front as well. The Sherman's 76mm gun, firing the ordinary steel armor-piercing shot, often could not be relied upon to defeat the sloped frontal armor of a T-34 at a distance. That was the hard reality that made the special tungsten cord ammunition so important. With that round in the breech, the odds shifted, and the Sherman could kill the enemy tank from the front at the ranges where most of these fights actually happened. But ammunition supply was never unlimited, and a crew might carry only a portion of its rounds in the precious tungsten cord type. So the contest very often came down to who saw whom first, who got the gun on target first, and who fired the first accurate shot. In that contest, the Sherman's superior sight, its smoother turret, and its better drilled crew were worth more than any number on an armor chart. When the war broke out, the central problem was not the design of the tank. It was simply getting enough of these machines to the fight in time. The Army had demobilized so thoroughly after 1945 that the occupation forces stationed in Japan had almost no medium tanks at all on hand. So the search began, and it was a genuine scramble across the whole Pacific. Mechanics pulled Shermans out of storage depots and ordnance yards and began the hard work of making long idle vehicles run again. In Japan, a provisional tank battalion was assembled from rebuilt Shermans gathered from wherever they could be found, and it shipped out to Busan at the very start of August. Back in the United States, another battalion famously rounded out its strength using tanks taken from monument displays, machines that had been bolted down as memorials on bases and were now hauled off their concrete pedestals, stripped, repaired, and made ready for war a second time. By August, the first of these American medium tanks were landing at Busan and rolling north toward the perimeter. Across the whole of 1950, more than 1,300 American tanks of all types would be shipped to Korea, and the most numerous medium tank among them, by the end of that year, would be the EZ-8 Sherman. The condition of these resurrected tanks tells you a great deal about how unready the army had been. Many had sat out in the open for years, their engines gummed and seized, their rubber perished, their optics clouded. Crews and mechanics worked around the clock to bring them back, cannibalizing parts from one hulk to make another run, fabricating what they could not find. The men who would crew them were themselves often a scratch force, gathered from wherever trained tankers could be located, and given little time to train together before they were committed. There was no luxury of preparation. A tank that ran and a crew that could shoot were needed at the front this week, not next month. That this improvised effort produced a force capable of meeting the vaunted T-34 at all is a quiet testament to the men who did the unglamorous work in the depots and the repair yards, far from any battlefield, whose names appear in no citation. Now, there is a powerful temptation in a story like this one to imagine that a single heroic tank arrived at the front and instantly swept the enemy from the field. That is not what happened, and the truth is more interesting than the legend. The Americans actually brought two different medium tanks to Korea in those weeks, and the more famous of the two was not the Sherman. It was a heavier, newer machine called the Pershing, built late in the Second World War for the specific job of killing the heaviest German tanks. The Pershing carried a powerful 90mm gun, larger than the Shermans, and on paper it was clearly the superior tank fighter. In the first dramatic armored clashes inside the Busan perimeter that August, it was Pershings, not Shermans, that scored some of the earliest clean kills against the T-34. That included a celebrated night action by Marine tanks on a ridge near the Naktong River, where the heavy 90mm rounds punched straight through enemy tanks at close range. If you judged only by gun against gun, the Pershing looked like the obvious future of American armor. But Korea was not a contest decided on paper. It was a country of steep hills, narrow dirt roads, soft flooded paddies, and old, weak bridges. And the ground itself began to decide which tank truly belonged there. The Pershing carried a serious hidden flaw. It used essentially the same engine as the much lighter Sherman, but it weighed many tons more than the Sherman did. That left it badly underpowered for its size, with a transmission that was strained and prone to failure. In the constant climbing and grinding of the Korean mountains, the Pershing overheated and broke down. The very qualities that made it deadly in a stationary duel, its heavy weight and its big gun, turned into liabilities on the rough roads it actually had to travel to reach a fight. The EZ-8 had the opposite character entirely. It was lighter. Its engine and its drivetrain were properly matched to its weight. It climbed the steep grades, crossed the fragile bridges that could not bear a heavier vehicle, and kept on running when the bigger tanks dropped out of the column with cracked transmissions and boiling radiators. This is the true heart of the whole story, and it is the part that almost never makes it into the headline. The tank that mattered most in Korea was not the one with the biggest gun on it. It was the one that kept moving when the others could not. The numbers behind this conclusion are striking, and they did not come from rumor or from the boasts of tank crews. They came from a careful study the Army itself commissioned after the fighting. Analysts from a research organization tied to Johns Hopkins University, called the Operations Research Office, went through the records of armored combat in Korea in painstaking detail. Their work, published in 1954, remains the backbone of what we reliably know about these battles. They identified 119 separate actions in which American tanks fought enemy tanks. And when they sorted those engagements by which American tank had taken part, the surplus Sherman, the supposedly obsolete machine, was present in fully half of them. The newer Pershing accounted for roughly a third. The improved tank that would later replace the Pershing made up only about a tenth. The old tank, by a wide margin, was doing the most of the actual work. The study turned up another detail that shapes how we should picture these fights. Tank battles in Korea were not long-range duels fought across open plains, like the great clashes in the deserts of North Africa. They were short, sudden, and close. A large share of the engagements happened at ranges of only a few hundred meters, often in the twisting confines of a valley road or a village, where a hidden tank could open fire from very near. At those distances, the first accurate shot was very often the decisive one. This was precisely the kind of fight in which the Sherman's faster fire control and better trained crews paid for themselves. The study also recorded that North Korean tank gunnery was frequently poor, and that many T-34s carried only a small number of armor-piercing rounds, sometimes firing high-explosive shells at American tanks because that was what they had loaded. The enemy machine was formidable, but the men inside it were not always a match for the Americans they faced. This is the part of the story that the fearsome reputation of the T-34 tends to hide. A tank is only ever as good as the crew sealed inside it, and the North Korean crews, for all their early success, were often less thoroughly trained than the Americans who eventually faced them across a few hundred meters of Korean ground. A well-sloped piece of armor and a heavy gun count for a great deal, but they do not load themselves, aim themselves, or hold their nerve when a hostile round cracks past the turret. In the close, savage, fast-moving fights that the Korean terrain forced on both sides, the advantage tilted again and again toward the side that was better drilled, better equipped to find and hit a target quickly, and steadier under fire. That side, more often than not, was the one in the old Sherman. The reliability gap showed up most damningly of all in the loss records. When the analysts looked at why United Nations tanks were knocked out of action through the first hard winter of the war, they found something that overturns the simple picture of armor combat. The majority of tank losses had nothing whatsoever to do with enemy fire. They were mechanical. Tanks simply broke down, threw a track, blew a transmission, or seized an engine on the brutal terrain, and had to be abandoned or recovered. And here the heavier American tanks paid a steep price. The bigger, newer machines broke down at roughly twice the rate of the lighter Sherman. The EZ-8 was not just present in more battles, it was still running and still fighting on days when the heavier tanks sat stranded and useless on the side of a mountain road. So return now to that ridge outside Cheongju on October 29, 1950, where this story began. By that point the war had turned over completely. A bold amphibious landing far behind the front lines at Incheon in September had cut the North Korean army's long supply lines in a single stroke, and the force that had nearly conquered the entire peninsula was suddenly in retreat and then in collapse. United Nations troops broke out of the Pusan perimeter, linked up with the landing force, and drove north, crossing the parallel and pushing deep into North Korea toward the Manchurian border. Second Lieutenant Francis Nordstrom led a platoon of EZ-8 Shermans belonging to the 89th Medium Tank Battalion. On that day they were supporting the advance of Australian infantry, part of the Commonwealth Brigade, as the column pressed on toward the town of Cheongju. The retreating North Koreans had decided to make a stand at Cheongju, and they had set the trap the intelligent way. They did not line up their last remaining T-34s on the open road to be picked off one by one. They dug them into the hillsides, hull down, so that only the turrets showed above the earth, and they covered those turrets with cut brush and branches so the tanks melted into the brown autumn terrain. A dug-in, camouflaged T-34 was still a very dangerous animal. Its 85mm gun could destroy a Sherman with a single well-placed hit, and the men crewing those tanks were fighting now not for conquest, but for survival, with their own border close at their backs and nowhere left to run. The first warning Nordstrom's crew received was that round cracking past the turret and slamming into the frozen earth. The duel that followed was not a clean, deliberate affair, fought at long range. It was close, fast, and confused, fought among the brush and the stepped rice terraces, where a concealed gun could open up from only a few dozen meters away and vanish again in the smoke. This was exactly the kind of brutal, short-range fight the Sherman and its crew were equipped to survive. The gunner searched the scrub for the muzzle flashes that betrayed each hidden tank. The fire control let the crew swing the gun, settle the sight, and send a round downrange faster than the enemy could answer. And working hand in glove with the infantry, who could crawl close and spot the camouflaged hulls that a buttoned-up tank crew might never see, the tanks and the foot soldiers together began to clear the dug in T-34s one at a time. It is worth remembering what such a fight actually demanded of the 5 men inside each tank. Sealed within a steel box, half blind, the air thick with the smell of burned propellant and hot metal, they worked by shouted commands and long practice. The commander searched through his vision blocks for the next threat. The gunner laid the sight where he was told and waited for the order to fire. The loader heaved the heavy rounds into the breech as fast as his arms would move. The driver nudged the tank forward and back to keep it from being an easy mark, while the assistant driver worked the hull machine gun against the enemy infantry creeping close. A single mistake, a moment too slow, a hull exposed for a heartbeat too long, and an 85mm round would end them all. They won that fight not through any magic in the steel around them, but through training, nerve, and the steady habits drilled into them long before they ever reached Korea. The fight that unfolded was a true combined effort, and the honest record of it matters more than any tidy legend. Nordstrom's platoon opened fire on the camouflaged positions, the Australian infantry closed in with their rocket launchers, and fighter planes worked the ridgeline from above. The Australians knocked out several of the dug in T-34s at short range with their bazookas, and one was famously destroyed when a soldier raked its external fuel tank with a light machine gun until the ammunition inside blew up. Across that day's fighting, the combined work of tanks, infantry, and aircraft destroyed 11 North Korean tanks and 2 self-propelled guns, and broke the back of the rear guard left to hold the town. The advance rolled on northward. It was not one legendary duel between champions that decided the day. It was many arms working together, and at the center of it, a reliable tank doing precisely the job it had been hauled across the Pacific to do, in difficult terrain where the heavier, more celebrated machine might have struggled even to arrive in time. And this is where the larger record truly matters, because Cheongju was not some isolated lucky action. It was one moment in a long, steady reversal of fortune. The respected armor historian Stephen Zaloga, whose detailed work on these tanks is among the most careful anywhere, tallied the combat score of the EZ-8 across the wider campaign. From July to November of 1950, Sherman tanks firing that special high-velocity ammunition were credited with destroying 41 enemy tanks. It is important to be exact about what that figure means. It is not the result of any single battle. It is the running total of the EZ-8's work across those 5 months, up and down the length of the peninsula, accumulated in dozens of small, sharp, half-forgotten actions, much like the one fought at Cheongju. It is the quiet arithmetic of a tank that simply kept showing up, day after day, where it was needed. It is worth pausing on that number, because precision is the difference between history and legend, and this channel cares about the difference. That total reflects what the crews were credited with at the time. Careful surveys of the battlefields afterward, going wreck by wreck, generally confirmed fewer kills than were claimed in the heat and confusion of combat. That is not a flaw peculiar to American crews. It is true of every army in every war ever fought, because a crew under fire cannot always tell whether the enemy tank it hit was destroyed, disabled, or merely abandoned. And the Sherman was never the only thing killing T-34s in Korea. American aircraft, ranging freely over the battlefield once air superiority was won, destroyed a great many of them. Mines, towed anti-tank guns, and infantry rocket teams accounted for many more. By the time the North Korean army was finally driven back across the parallel in the autumn, the overwhelming majority of its original tank fleet had been wiped out. The armored brigade that had crossed the border in June, so certain of victory, had been ground down to a remnant. The machine that had seemed unstoppable in July was, by November, a burned-out wreck on 100 Korean hillsides, and the EZ-8 was one important instrument among several that did the destroying. What the Sherman offered was never a miracle. It was something far more valuable across a long campaign. It was consistency. The tank was there in June's disasters and there in October's pursuit, the same dependable machine, asking only for fuel and ammunition, and a crew that knew its trade. The wider truth that the United States Army carried away from Korea is the real point of this entire story, and it cuts directly against the natural instinct to always reach for the biggest possible gun. In a straight, stationary, head-to-head duel, the heavier Pershing was indeed the more lethal tank, and the Army's own study said so plainly. But Korea was never a series of clean, stationary duels. It was a war of constant movement across some of the most punishing terrain in the world, and in that war, the qualities that decided outcomes were reliability, mobility, and the simple, unglamorous ability to be present, where you were needed, when you were needed. Measured against those demands, the old surplus Sherman came out ahead, and the Army responded in the most telling way possible. It did not order a fresh run of Pershings. Instead, it pulled the troubled Pershing out of the line and replaced it, not with the Sherman either, but with a new tank that took the Pershing's powerful 90mm gun and at last married it to a properly matched engine and transmission. The hard lesson had been absorbed. Firepower counts for nothing if it is sitting motionless on the shoulder of a mountain road with a blown transmission and a crew waiting on a recovery vehicle. Francis Nordstrom never became a household name, and neither did the tank he commanded. The men of the 89th Medium Tank Battalion and the other Sherman units did their work, took their losses, and largely melted back into ordinary civilian life when the fighting finally ended. There is no single iconic photograph of the EZ-8 in Korea to stand beside the famous images of the great tanks of the Second World War. The machine had already enjoyed its moment of fame in an earlier and more celebrated conflict. In Korea, it served instead as the dependable old veteran rather than the dashing newcomer, and it asked for no glory in return. It simply started in the bitter cold, climbed the next hill, and was ready and waiting when the brush along the road began to move. That, in the end, is exactly why the EZ-8 deserves to be remembered, and why the simple version of this tale, the one where a single wonder weapon arrives just in time and saves the day, gets the history badly wrong. The T-34 was not beaten by one superior machine that outclassed it in every measure. It was beaten by an entire system working together, by air power and artillery and the raw courage of the infantry, and by a humble, aging tank that possessed one decisive virtue above all others. It worked. It worked day after day, in a place that broke far newer and more impressive tanks than itself. The deeper question that Korea forced into the open has never really gone away, and you can still see it plainly on that same divided peninsula today. The problem that defined the summer of 1950 was the problem of armor that the other side could not stop, and the desperate search for an answer to it. The geography of the place has not changed at all. Korea remains a land of steep mountains, narrow valleys, and rivers, terrain that punishes a tank built too heavy and quietly rewards a tank that can actually move through it. That very logic is written directly into the modern war machines that face one another across the border now. South Korea today fields one of the finest tanks anywhere in the world, the K-2 Black Panther. It is a powerful and sophisticated design, yet it is deliberately kept lighter than many comparable Western tanks, and it is fitted with an advanced suspension that lets it adjust its own stance to suit the country's steep hills and its aging bridges. In spirit, it is the very same answer the EZ-8 once represented. Build the machine for the ground you will actually have to fight on, not for an idealized battlefield that does not exist. North Korea, for its part, still leans heavily on large numbers of older Soviet-derived tanks, while parading a newer domestic design in small numbers, a machine that has yet to prove anything in real combat. The main American battle tank, the Abrams, remains stationed on the peninsula as well, a heavier and immensely capable vehicle, whose own logistics tell a familiar story about the cost of weight. The modern parallel runs deeper than weight alone. South Korea built its tank to be sustained, repaired, and kept running by its own industry, so that the machine would still be fighting deep into a long war rather than sitting idle for want of a part. That is the same hard wisdom the Easy 8 taught in 1950, only learned in advance this time. A weapon is only as good as the number of days it can stay in the fight, and an army that forgets this lesson tends to relearn it at terrible cost, in the opening weeks of a war it was not ready for. The weapons have changed almost beyond recognition since 1950. The mountains have not changed at all, and the question that the Easy 8 answered in its quiet, unglamorous way is still the very question that hangs over that hard border today. When two armies face each other across ground this unforgiving, victory does not always go to the side with the thickest armor or the largest gun. Very often it goes instead to the machine that is still running when the shooting finally starts. The T-34 crossed the parallel in 1950, utterly certain that nothing on earth could stop it. In the end, it was stopped, at least in part, by a tank the world had already made up its mind to forget. The line drawn on the map in that war has barely shifted in more than 70 years since, and the reason traces back to a desperate summer, a frantic scramble for anything at all that could fight, and a tired old Sherman that simply refused to quit.